Thank you so much. I want to thank George and his wonderful team for all the work that they've done, and it's really been a wonderful conference. And I was thinking about a story about some astronauts who were on the shuttle, and a new guy arrives after these other folks have been up there for 6 months. And so he's introduced to them, and after a while somebody shouts out a number and everybody starts laughing. And somebody shouts another number and they laugh. And he asks the guy next to him, what's going on here? And he says, well, you know, we've known each other for so long that rather than telling the jokes, we've just numbered them. And so another guy yells out a number and nobody laughs. And he says, well, how come nobody laughed? And he says, well, he just doesn't know how to tell a joke. So I'm going to try something similar to that because after I heard Tony Charles, I said, my speech is going to be considerably shortened as a result of the one that you gave. And then I heard people talk about CED, Brendan Reimer and Doug Leonis and Mike Toy and Rupert Downing, and they all did such wonderful jobs that I felt like I could shorten my speech. So I think I'd like to have you clap for each one of the people that I mentioned, and then Kevin Lynch, you can clap for him, and then I should be able to sit down, right? Except they did shorten my speech, but being an academic, rather than giving my traditional hour-and-a-half speech, I'm going to try to do it in 45 minutes. So I'll be talking about community-based, community capitals and place-based initiatives. And also, if you heard Cornelia Flora, she shortened my speech quite a bit because she also talked about the community capitals. And so capital are resources invested to create new resources over a long time horizon. So we get the sustainability part in there. And so it's important, I think, as we think about different kinds of capital, that we distinguish between place-based and financialized capital. And so place-based capital is capital in which one can see the impacts very clearly, whereas as we saw in the recent financial crisis that began in 2007, that things like securitization and the slicing and dicing of investments mystifies the capital so that one doesn't even know what it is you're purchasing or selling. And similarly, even with the stock market, there's very little concern about many of the other aspects of the firm that you happen to be buying or selling. So we have multiple capital outcomes with place-based initiatives, whereas the results of financial capital, financialized capital, is measured only in terms of financial capital. And as I suggested then, place-based orientations involves patient money in a long time horizon, or what we might call a mix of use value and exchange value. When we're investing in our community, often use value is as important as exchange value. Exchange value is the only element of financialized capital, and similarly, then as an outcome of all of this, local originated investments result in local benefits where investments that originate locally under financialized capital very quickly leave the community. The triple bottom line is very important as we think about community capitals. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, mainly because Tony dealt with it so nicely in his talk. So we have healthy ecosystems, social inclusion, and a vital economy. Now I want to say a little bit about a research project that one of my colleagues at Iowa State did, Terry Besser, and she looked at rural entrepreneurship. And the rural areas do have a handicap compared to urban areas, and the rural handicap has to do with being farther away from markets and suppliers, low economies of scale, lack of infrastructure, problems in attracting and retaining employees, and often entrepreneurs are pretty lonely in rural areas, so they don't have someone to talk to. So the metropolitan advantage is the reverse of that. Lots of people, agglomeration, regular interaction, and exchange of information are much easier in metro areas than they are in rural areas. But entrepreneurs are very important for rural development, and although it's still extensively practiced in the States, in general, the industrial recruitment concept is, I think, if not discredited, at least the shine has come off of it. And it's recognized that if you have local development, locally based development, which are often smaller firms, but they are more likely to persist and more likely to return a higher proportion of the sales have a higher multiplier effect within the local community. And what Terry found also was that local business owners are more committed to the general welfare of the community. So again, this balance between use value and exchange value. So her study involved using the American Profiles business operators list, and then she sent questionnaires to a sample from that, and came up with some rather interesting results. You'll see that most were male, most were white, and they had been in business for quite some time. And although these are small businesses, they are still large in comparison to the Latino businesses that I'll be talking about in a moment in our communities in Iowa. So here's what she found, that in the rural communities, there was a push motivation to get involved, to become an entrepreneur. Often there weren't other opportunities. It also provided flexibility, and there was a concern about contributing to the community. She also found that successful small businesses were more likely to be located in communities with substantial amounts of social capital. What was not related to success was your level of education as an entrepreneur, or the experiences, the amount of experience that you had had. And the pull motivations were not very important. So that in metro areas, it's exactly the reverse. The push motivations were those who experienced push motivations were less successful in the metro areas. So what I now want to do is talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done, and I'll be focusing primarily on Latino entrepreneurs in rural Iowa. And Kevin Lynch mentioned the need for immigrants in Nova Scotia. So I think you can take what I'll be saying about Iowa as representing the concept of having a more diverse group of people in your community and a more diverse workforce. And you may have heard that in the U.S. we're trying to pass immigration reform, and there's a whole lot of controversy about whether immigrants are a positive or a negative contribution to the nation and to the local communities. Again, the political dialogue is not reflective of the academic dialogue, and it's rather like global warming, the global warming controversy. It's pretty clear that immigrants do make a major contribution, and so some of the research that's been done by one of the advocacy organizations indicates that if the unauthorized immigrants in Iowa were to leave, Iowa would lose about $1.4 billion. And certainly one can see when you visit rural communities in Iowa, those that have substantial numbers of Latinos and other immigrants, and the immigrant stream is diversifying now. They have storefronts that are filled rather than being closed, and for our state as a whole, if it were not for the immigrants, Iowa in the 1990s would have lost population and would have only gained a minuscule amount without the Latino immigration. So I'm going to base the things that I talk about or the examples that I use on some of the projects that we've done in Iowa. And we worked on developing a training center and a farm incubator at a local community college. We had projects in which we attempted to grow Latino farmers from community and market gardeners. We also examined small-town Latino businesses in 4 communities and compared them with Latino social innovators. And we did a photo voice project with Latino youth, having them reflect upon the meaning of food in their lives and their culture. And then lastly, I'll say a little bit about a more advocacy oriented project that I, in my retirement, I'm going to spend more time with. So let me talk a little bit about the different kinds of capital. And usually we start out with financial capital at the very end because it's the one that usually gets priority, and sort of overshadows all of the other capitals. But since we're talking about entrepreneurship and business creation and so on, I'll start with financial capital and then try to illustrate how what we often think is financial capital may be another kind of capital. And one of the really important things about the community capitals framework is that the capitals work best in concert, and they overlap and contribute to one another. And if we have an imbalance among the capitals, then the community as a whole tends to suffer. So as we look at financial capital, we're talking about savings and business earnings and payments for environmental services, loans and credits, investments, taxes, tax exemptions, user fees, and gifts and philanthropy. So what we're striving for is appropriately diverse and healthy economies. So we can measure the positive impacts of financial capital in terms of reductions in poverty, increased firm efficiency, increased firm diversity, and increased assets of the local people. So it isn't simply gross domestic product, but rather we're concerned about the distribution of that financial capital. So what we found was that Latino businesses are perhaps different from those that are started by domestic entrepreneurs, in that they can call upon previous business experiences in Mexico or Central America or other parts of the U.S. Capital from business or home ownership in previous locations is frequently a way that they're able to start businesses in the rural communities in Iowa. And most of the communities that have substantial Latino populations are ones that are meatpacking plants, have meatpacking plants. So people come to work in the meatpacking plant initially, but it's extremely difficult physically, and people very quickly look for other ways of earning a living. So they may get capital from working in the packing plant as well. Family capital is often used, and bank credit is rarely used, but credit card credit is sometimes used. And then sometimes they bring capital from the outside, as I suggested. So one of the things that we found in our studies of the rural business people, Latino business people in Iowa, was that there was a great deal of difference in terms of how entrepreneurial they were, and entrepreneurialism was not a unidimensional element. So we were able to separate out different kinds of entrepreneurship, and I'll talk about two kinds today. One is service innovators who have introduced a new product or service, and for some reason they tended to have lived in a small community in their country of origin. And an example of this kind of entrepreneur was a restaurateur in one of the communities. And this person had acquired experience in the restaurant business in Chicago before coming to Iowa. Most immigrants arrive at certain gateway cities or regions, and then come to rural Iowa. And so their experiences in working in metropolitan areas often are important for their ability to work, to become entrepreneurs. And in this case, this helped him in treating he had been a supervisor, a low-level supervisor, and it taught him to treat workers well, and the importance of being physically present whenever people were working, which means he spent an awful lot of time in the restaurant, of course. And the most important innovation was having a buffet, which may not sound terribly innovative, but there were lots who didn't do that. And the reason that was important was that you have this language barrier on both sides, and having a buffet makes it more comfortable for native U.S. people to go to a Mexican restaurant because they don't have to pronounce the names of the different dishes. They just go and serve themselves. And so he said, hardly any Americans came here, but I put in the buffet, and with this buffet thing, many American people came, and that helped me to get to know others. And now people come from everywhere to eat my food. And then the next type of innovator that we found was the marketing innovator. And the example that I wanted to use for that is a business called La Tortilleria. And then, as happens in many cases, they added a restaurant onto their tortilla business, and that was called La Pasadita. And again, this person had experience with tortilla machines in Denver, and they'd actually had imported a used one from Denver to this small rural town. And saved a lot of money in buying it. And then they began delivering tortillas to other towns nearby. So those were the kinds of marketing innovations that this particular firm engaged in. And interestingly, this was the most robust kind of entrepreneur. They had the largest number of full-time employees. They tended to have come from urban areas in their country of origin, and they were more involved in political and organizational activities within their new adopted community. The non-innovating firms tended to have been open a shorter amount of time, and that may have also had to do with the fact that we were doing the study in 2009, right after the recession. So there may have been people who had that kind of push factor of lack of sufficient employment to get involved in becoming entrepreneurs. Probably one of the most important things was that this group of entrepreneurs felt less comfortable in speaking English, but they were also tentative entrepreneurs because many of them didn't describe themselves as business owners as their primary occupation. So one of the issues, particularly with the non-entrepreneurial businesses, is this conundrum of, on the one hand, you have cultural capital, which manifests itself in strong familism, but it also means that you distrust people who are outside your family. So the different stores will tend to seek the same market niche. And often that's in the food area. And they will start out as a restaurant and add groceries, or start out as a grocery store and add a restaurant. And you'll see several businesses in the same community that have almost the exact same kinds of goods and services. So they focus on customer loyalty. So they provide everything that their customer might need, which contributes to the duplication. And then, of course, the only way that you can outdo your competitors then is to stay open longer. And so that reduces their participation in the larger community. But as I indicated, there are those who do break out of that kind of a problem. So some of the applied implications of our study of the Latino businesses were that we think that credit unions, banks, and microloan programs are much needed, particularly the non-banking aspects of that, since they do tend to distrust banks. They don't start with a business plan, so there are opportunities for education in that area. And there are very diverse needs according to types of businesses. And lastly, then having a path to authorization and citizenship would encourage much greater community involvement. So we're tentatively hopeful that the comprehensive immigration reform will pass. Now, cultural capital is, we started out with 4 or 5 capitals, 4 I guess, and gradually added additional ones. And cultural capital is one that we think is really important. It's important not only for minority groups, but it's important to use that cultural capital lens with the dominant group too, because it involves what the term that we use in Spanish is cosmovisión, sort of the worldview that you have. It's a way of linking the seen and the unseen. It involves collective identity. It determines what we believe that it is possible to change. And then there are also issues of hegemony, of cultural hegemony as well. So cultural capital, there are differences in meaning and use of all the capitals are recognized and valued. Ancestral knowledge and language are maintained. And this, of course, is another important issue when we're talking about the immigration question. What is the role of the languages that people come with? And there's a good deal of evidence that indicates, and a couple of our communities do have programs, dual language programs. And if people can maintain their ability to speak their native tongue while at the same time learning a new language, that's very helpful. In the Photo Voice project, one of the students took this picture of his mother who's cooking milanesa de pollo, and he says, "This picture shows the preparation of the food after being grown. The picture is important to me because in almost all Latino families, the mother cooks the food. My mom makes all the food we eat delicious. That's why I prefer to stay home and eat rather than going out. I think that home-cooked meals taste better and healthier than going out to eat." And one of the things that we know is that immigrants come with better eating habits than they acquire after they've been here for a while. And that would be particularly true for those who are of lower socioeconomic status, who find themselves working many, many hours a day, who rely on fast food, and eventually have all of the problems of obesity and related diseases that the rest of us have. Human capital, of course, is very important. That is the characteristics and potential of individuals that are determined by the intersection of nature and nurture. And so it includes education, it includes the skills that we have, and we may acquire those in many different ways. It also has to do with health. You have to be healthy in order to in order to provide human capital to the collective effort. And self-esteem and self-efficacy are also important. So one of the goals of human capital is to increase use of the knowledge, skills, and abilities of local people. Identify the motivations and abilities of each individual and group to improve the community, increase the skills and the health of individuals, and recombine skills and abilities of youth, families, and community leaders. Then going on to social capital, that involves mutual trust, sort of a very baseline aspect of social capital. It involves reciprocity, and reciprocity is defined not in terms of two individuals having mutual obligations with each other, but it's defined at a community level, so that reciprocity means you do something for me and I do something for someone else, so that the community as a whole is better off. Organizing into groups builds social capital. Collective identity generally follows then from that, and a sense of a shared future as a result of working together and building the collective identity and the mutual trust and so forth. So that's what social capital is. And one of the things that we attempted in our projects was to move community gardeners to becoming market gardeners or to becoming farmers. And one of the things that we found was that there was a good deal of resistance to that within the Latino community. They were very happy to garden, but the purpose for growing things was different than we had anticipated. And so one person who worked in the meatpacking company who also had a plot in the community gardens that were sponsored in part by that meatpacking company says, so he grew chiles. See, with chiles, I take bags of them to work, and there I take out my chiles, and if people ask me, will you give me one? I say, sure, man, take what you want. Yes, every day I have my bag with my chiles and other produce. Look at those tomatillos. Many people came and took them. So what was going on here? He was building social capital within his workplace, not only with other Latinos, but with all of the people within that meatpacking plant. So one goal of social capital is improved community initiative, responsibility, and adaptability. So again, we have shared visions. We build first on the internal resources. Strong families are a basis for community participation. We see that particularly in the Latino community, and it's also a shared value between Latinos and rural Iowans, and I'm sure rural people in Canada as well. So it involves looking for alternative ways to respond to constant changes, loss of the victim mentality. And that seems to be, I don't know if that's the way it is in Canada, but particularly in communities that are resource-based, who that for one reason or another have lost the employment aspects of being a resource-based community, will often look to the past and say, well, it was those were the golden days. But that often prevents one from looking forward and saying, well, we have certain assets, how can we combine them and move forward? When we talk about social capital, we divide it into bridging and bonding social capital. And what we think is that it's the combination of those two, how they combine with each other, that determines the type of community that we end up with. So in communities where you have low bonding and low bridging, you end up with extreme individualism. And probably the best example of that would be gated communities alongside other neighborhoods where there's a good deal of poverty, for instance. And so the rich people are able to build walls in order to supposedly protect themselves, and the poor don't have very many options. Then when we have high bridging and low bonding, we have something that is called clientelism. I think that's spelled wrong. I think it should be clientelism. So that allows community projects to be driven by outsiders and the local people. It's sort of your classic single industry town syndrome. Then if it's the reverse, where we have high bonding and low bridging, then often we have strong boundaries. We either are a sort of a fortress community fighting the outside, or we have divisions within our community, boundaries that separate us within our community. So what we're really working toward is high bridging and high bonding, or a balance between the two, where we can have progressive participation, communities act together to reach common goals, and a recognition of the unique assets that all members of the community have. Now, political capital is the ability of groups to influence standards, regulations, and enforcement of those regulations that determine the distribution of resources and the ways they're used. And when we're able to do the hour-and-a-half talks, we talk about the fact that regulations probably are as important, or maybe even more important than laws, because it depends on who has the influence on exactly how the implementation of those laws are interpreted. So political capital involves having voice. It involves power and how power is exercised. It involves organization, and it involves connections. So we can build political capital among all members of the community if everyone has voice and influence. Organized groups work together to improve the community or the region. Youth and excluded people know and feel comfortable around powerful people. One of the things that we find in rural communities in the U.S. is that particularly those that are declining communities, is that people say, well, you know, we really need to have our young people stay around here. But then when young people try to get involved, the old people say, oh, well, we tried that 25 years ago and it didn't work. So how you involve those those people who lack power in the community is really important. Concern for all the capitals are part of the agenda in the regulation and distribution of resources. I think I'll skip this one because I'm running short on time. But basically, we looked at the business persons and the social innovators, and all Latinos, and found that the social innovators were much more likely to speak Spanish, to be comfortable in English. They were somewhat more educated. They also had more bonding social capital, and they had much more political capital than did the business people. And so business people were respected, and it was not that they weren't willing to contribute. They would contribute funds to raffles or community festivals and so forth, but they simply didn't have the time, or perhaps feared getting involved because it might hurt their business. I also I wanted to talk about the other more advocacy-oriented activity that I've been involved in, and that is in something called the Mid-Iowa Organizing Strategy. And it's an affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation, and some of you may have heard of Saul Alinsky, a great community organizer of the 1940s into the 1970s. And what Alinsky says is that change means movement, movement means friction, friction means heat, and heat means controversy. So in other words, if you have power imbalances, there's no way of dealing with those imbalances without getting involved in controversy and sometimes positive kinds of conflict. So our local organization has the legacy of Saul Alinsky, and we organize through churches and synagogues and mosques, and so the most important thing that is taught within this organization is that we want to move from power over to power with. And so the power over is limited and divisive, while power with is infinite and unifying. Power without love is tyranny. Love without power is sentimentality. So power over is one way, and power with involves give and take and reciprocity. So power over can lead to the use of force, where power with results in smart bargaining and taking the role of the other, understanding what your adversary wants, so that you can work with them for a mutually desirable outcome. And power over generally has to do with an unequal distribution of money. Power with requires the involvement of people. So just very quickly, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the projects that we have had, which is something called Project Iowa. And it's basically a program that brings together low-income people who need jobs with employers and with education or training institutions. And our program began in 2012, and we have basically two areas. We've been training people in advanced manufacturing, including welding, and we've also been training them in the health field, which is a very rapidly growing field and will grow even more rapidly after the Affordable Care Act is implemented at the beginning of next year. And it involves wraparound kinds of services so that people have the resources that they need in order to continue their training, and they also support one another so that when your child is sick or you just get overwhelmed, that you don't quit the program. And so we've had wonderful success with it in all areas except for for funding, which is interesting because our governor said that he wanted to create 200,000 jobs during his tenure, and as near as we can tell, he's created a very small number of jobs, and those 57 jobs that we created last year, and we're going to double that this year. And the good thing is that we have convinced the governor to provide $100,000 for the project. So we're moving forward, and it's really amazing. We have graduations every 6 months, and you can see the joy in the faces of the graduates, and you also see that it's a family issue as well, so it's a wonderful program, and it really attests to this idea of how you view power of political capital. Built capital then involves the constructed aspects, which are important for bringing about the success with the other capitals. Physical infrastructure works best if it has multiple uses, if it can be locally maintained and improved, if it links people together equitably, and if it links local people, institutions, and businesses to the outside. And then lastly, natural capital is extremely important, and particularly as Tony mentioned, that we are at pretty serious juncture with scarcity of natural resources and peak oil, et cetera, as well as global warming, so that that's part of the context that impinges upon what we try to do in our communities. And so the objectives for natural capital are that human communities plan and act in concert with the natural systems. Ecosystems are used for multiple community benefits, and those with alternative uses of the ecosystem seek common ground. And I think this is particularly important in the US, where we have political gridlock, that many of the things that could be done at the national level have to be done at the local level, simply because we're not able to act nationally. So to sum up then, as we think about the different kinds of capitals, perhaps this is the natural state of those capitals in our communities. But as we attempt to organize and have the capitals work in concert, then we get a picture that looks a lot more like this. So again, just to remind you of the 7 capitals and the triple bottom line as we think about that. So this is our cat. I hope you're not in that state right now, but questions? Yeah.
We were having a discussion yesterday about rural areas in Newfoundland.
I'm sorry about.
The rural areas in Newfoundland.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the importance of tourism and ecosystem. And I guess a picture in a previous presentation was of it was Tahiti. And the thing was, is coming from Newfoundland, we only really had 2 months of summer.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got a lot of people in these rural areas, they all have access to the internet. They all want things. I mean, there's being more, but they also want more.
Mm-hmm.
The more globalized we're getting, and the more access we have to the internet, the more people want to explore the world. So if you're living in a rural area, people want to make money.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a big proponent of industry actually investing into rural areas. And, you know, there is going to be an environmental impact somehow. I mean, anything that's introduced into your environment that's foreign, there's going to be an impact. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, because we have some speakers that are more towards the conservation side of things. And I'm all about balance and protecting the environment, but what are your thoughts on kind of injecting investors' dollars into a local economy, like aquaculture, for example?
Well, it seems to me that if communities are focused on optimizing all of those community capitals, then they can respond to whatever conditions they're facing better. So in other words, just to give you an example, the meatpacking plants in the US, it's really hard to say on balance whether they are a positive or a negative factor. If I had my preferences, I would like to see pasture-raised animals and smaller meatpacking plants and so forth. But on the other hand, if we look at these communities that have the meatpacking plants, those are the communities that are more vibrant, that have greater diversity and so forth. And so the real question is, given the fact that you have one of those meatpacking plants, what do you do with all of these assets, these capitals that are available to you, and how do you combine them in a way that makes it a better place to live? And it seems to me that when we're talking about resource extraction, that is probably true also, although I would say that some kinds of resource extraction maybe we need to look at very carefully as to whether it should actually happen. And I won't mention names, but so I don't know if I've answered your question, but it seems to me that you really have to think about, okay, what are our circumstances, and then how do we make the best of what it is, of the assets that we have. And so if you're thinking about tourism in Newfoundland, you have to be thinking about other things for the other 10 months of the year, right? And maybe the fact that people get on the internet and get the wanderlust can also be used as a way of producing some things that could then be marketed over the internet, and so then if you say that that's what we want to do, then how do you do it? And it has to be done through collective effort, and some of the concepts of agglomeration, even if you're talking about a small community of, so how do we organize to produce things that will come back to the local community? When people make an internet sale, it will know that they're likely to spend that in the local grocery store, or some communities don't have a grocery store. So then the part of the collective effort has to be, okay, how are we going to provide ourselves with food? And there are various options there, so that you could have, and certainly the social economy can be important as well. So it's not an easy process, but it seems to me that's the direction in which to go.
Access to capital. I know in one of your slides you were talking about the Latino community, and all of the money they had was their own capital. They're bootstrapping all of these enterprises. Through some of your research, did you see, when the community started to come together, did you see investment in these organizations? Did you see the credit unions or the banks starting to open up the opportunity of investment, or is that remaining a significant problem?
It's really interesting about the banking system in many of these communities. The banking system was one of the first institutions to hire Spanish-speaking tellers and so forth. So what really happened was that in terms of home mortgages, the banks got in early, and I'm always amazed at this commitment that Latinos in these rural communities have toward home ownership, and often they'll buy houses that probably should have been demolished and make them into something. We held a focus group in one of the communities on housing, and people told their stories, and it just wanted to make you cry. They had bought these terrible houses. Sometimes they'd been cheated by the people who sold them to them. Sometimes the people that sold them to them were Latinos, and sometimes they were Anglos. But they made the best of it. And improved the quality of their housing tremendously. So with respect to the banking system, then the real question is, how do you get them to make the jump from providing home mortgages to providing funds, say, for starting a business? And they're much more reticent to do that at this point. I do think that credit unions can be an important element here, that credit unions have this really strong service aspect to them, and therefore I would think they, and if they're locally owned and controlled, that they would more likely maybe take, I don't think it's a really major risk that they would be taking, because in a sense, supporting many of these businesses is not that risky. People are going to make them succeed, at least at a certain level. They may not grow terribly fast if they're not so entrepreneurial, but they will remain on Main Street and contribute to the economy of the community. So it's partly educating that banking system and providing new alternatives in terms of microcredit and credit unions. Yeah.
I have a question for you, but in order to lay out my premise, I'm just speaking, it was generality, so I apologize ahead of time to everyone. It seems to me that in the case of Iowa, because you have the meat packing plants, somebody somewhere in that family has a job, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the big conundrum in my mind in terms of looking at things like community economic development is that in that case, what you're really looking at is families improving their lives,
Mhm.
improving the conditions of their lives,
Mhm.
the income levels, the relationship to communities, which of course will improve the economic well-being of the entire community. And I think you've done a great job in showing the pathways to not just resilience, but actually better lifestyles for everyone in the entire town. But there is a job and there is an industry.
Mhm.
Some of the questions that I have sometimes when I look at a situation like Sydney, which, has lost a lot of its, what they call in regional development, it's propulsive industries. Remember all that propulsive industry stuff for regional
Mhm.
development? It seems to me that community economic development becomes almost like a way to survive, but
Mhm.
there is no placenta anywhere
Mm.
to nourish even the embryonic bits of life that gather around community capitals. And I wonder if there's a way to solve that without the propulsive industries, but I, maybe with age, begin to think that there isn't.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I guess, sort of backing up to the propulsive industries again, if you have had one of those industries and it's left, do you want to try that again? So that's one.
Well, you have a better one, right? You had,
Yeah.
it wasn't better, though, they had a less paying and less secure one with the
Yeah.
call centers, right? But that was also getting at a little bit of a Band-Aid.
Mhm.
But it's just a question, regardless
Yeah.
of that type of industry,
Yeah.
whether you need a propulsive industry, but not necessarily one that creates carbon.
Yeah. I think that it's also important to say that communities often cannot do everything by themselves, and that you have to have the positive policy environment that allows communities to to build on the various capitals and so forth. So I think what has been talked about with CED and now I'm blanking on where it was, but in one, I thought it was Alberta, but I'm not sure, where they had convinced the provincial government to actually put money behind the plan for development, which would then allow communities to obtain neighborhood grants and so forth. Who talked about that?
Manitoba.
What's that?
Manitoba.
Okay, it was Manitoba, that's right, yeah, okay. Those sorts of things can be very important, I think, for communities that are really struggling. And so I don't think that locality development is ever a substitute for good provincial and national policy. I mean, sometimes it has to be a substitute because like in our country, the folks on the national level are out to lunch, But we assume that that's temporary. Yeah, go ahead.
I found it kind of remarkable, the finding, I think you cited from someone else's research, saying that in rural areas, the core motivation, trying to push motivations were way more important than push motivations.
Uh-huh.
And how do you account for that?
I think a part of it is that in rural areas, the pull motivation, well, it strikes me that probably you have to look at cultural capital and what people's values are. And people are not making decisions just about the bottom line, but about family and about community. And so often the push motivations tend to be dominant over the pull. There's also pretty strong norms about being ostentatious, and in many rural areas in the U.S., at least historically, it may have changed recently, but the children of bankers are very careful not to have too fancy cars and too fancy clothes at school. There's kind of a norm of we're all just folks. So I think some of those sorts of things are important. And then in some cases, the push part is the lack of other options. So it's a combination of things, I think.
Project Iowa, where do you get the blueprint for that idea?
It actually comes out of the Industrial Areas Foundation. So that there's a national organization, and then there are these local chapters. They're mostly located in urban areas, unfortunately. However, there is a very strong rural one in the borderlands in Texas. But the first one was in San Antonio. So when we were thinking about organizing one in the Des Moines, Ames, Iowa area, we visited the folks in San Antonio and saw how they had done it. And that was really important. We didn't end up doing it exactly the same. Their program is oriented primarily toward a 2-year degree, where ours, although in part the training occurs in community colleges, it's shorter term training at this point. We think that we'll gradually move toward that 2-year post-secondary degree. But it really is very helpful to have models from which you can modify to your own local circumstances. Yeah, in the back.
In your study, it appears everybody was very individualistic. There didn't seem to be any group dynamic with the Latino community. Wondered if you ran into any of that, where the Latino community maybe got together as a group and developed a business, or whether the supporting people to this particular business the Latino community originally and then move on to the general community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would say rather than individualism, it's probably the more correct term would be familism.
Yeah, family.
And that can be, I mean, there are important elements of that are very positive. I think if you look at the school system, the parents may not be very educated, but they always show up for parent-teacher conferences, for instance. But when we're talking about small businesses, as I suggested, you have tremendous competition among these small businesses. So I think the way to start thinking about that is to think about business networks that cross communities, so that you're talking with people from other communities and not just your own, so you don't feel that you're in direct competition with them. There is sort of mixed success in terms of chambers of commerce, either having, in metropolitan areas, you will often have a Hispanic chamber of commerce. In smaller communities, that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, and so Hispanics or Latinos need to be recruited to the local chambers of commerce. But that involves a good deal of education for the Anglos, so that they understand how they can make themselves relevant to the Latino business people. So I don't, well, those are just a couple ideas. I don't think I fully answered your question. Any more questions? Looks like we